The basic premise of Toni Morrison's novel, God Help the Child, is that we must heal our inner child in order to thrive as healthy and happy adults, but also so that we can break the generational cycle of abuse or neglect and help future generations to thrive and heal as well. Welcome to Colorism Healing. I am Dr. Sarah Webb, and in this video I'm going to give you some background, a summary, and analysis of Toni Morrison's 2015 novel, God Help the Child. My hope is that if you're watching this video, you already know who Toni Morrison is, so I won't give you a long background history of her life or her works. But I think it's important to acknowledge that Toni Morrison did see this more recent novel, God Help the Child, as a second attempt or a kind of sequel to Picola's fate and destiny in her first novel, The Bluest Eye. Many people talk about how The Bluest Eye was one of the early novels to really look at the impact of internalized racism, internalized oppression, colorism, texturism, self-loathing, that sort of thing, being one of those tragic consequences. And while The Bluest Eye is obviously a worthy classic, Toni Morrison has said that she never really felt fully settled or content about Picola's fate in the novel. And so with God Help the Child, we as the readers, but also the young black girl protagonist, gets an alternative narrative. While a lot of critics diminish the craft in God Help the Child, especially in comparison to The Bluest Eye, I often wonder how much of that is the result of fetishizing black trauma and black pain. It seems like because The Bluest Eye was so tragic, that healing and optimism that we get in God Help the Child is kind of boring for a lot of people. And in God Help the Child, we see examples of abuse and trauma being enacted on white people. And so I just question why critics are saying that this novel is less successful or less artistic or less well done as the first novel. That said, God Help the Child does have its fair share of trauma, thus necessitating the focus on healing in the first place. So let's start with the overarching summary. What happens in the book? The plot is driven by the central conflict between the main character, Bride, who has changed her name from Lula Ann, and her boyfriend, Booker, who's just walked out on her. This present day rejection triggers Bride's regression back to the young girl that she has been trying to run away from her entire adult life. That young girl was rejected by the entire world and even her own parents, simply because she had dark black skin. One of the first ways that Bride tries to sever her connection to the past is by changing her name from Lula Ann. She describes that name as being too countrified. Bride grew up to be a successful businesswoman working in the beauty industry and even starting her own line of cosmetics called You Girl. You Girl. You Girl. As Bride became more successful in her adult years, she also changed her image by wearing only all white. So the novel talks about how she would only ever wear white, different shades of white, from her accessories, including her shoes. For earrings, she would wear pearls or diamonds. And these changes sort of flip the script. While she wasn't necessarily loved by the world, she was somewhat seen, acknowledged. She affected people. They noticed her, and many of them even admired her for her striking looks. However, it becomes quite clear, quite fast, that these are only surface changes, cosmetic changes, if you will, and that Bride has not really overcome her past. The other half of the story is that her boyfriend Booker is also running from his own past. Their resistance to facing their childhood wounds and acknowledging the damage that those wounds caused is preventing both of them from being able to move forward in a healthy, happy way as adults, together or separately. While Bride grows. While Bride goes on a road trip to find her boyfriend and reconnect with him, we see that they are both challenged to speak the truth, to acknowledge and admit what happened to them, and that opens up the doorway for both of them to heal and reconnect with one another. Throughout the story, we also meet other characters who have experienced child abuse in various forms, and we also see how a number of adults, the sort of larger community of adults, lies in order to protect the perpetuators, and also just plays a role and is very complicit in the abuse and neglect that children are experiencing around them. And looking back at Bride's history, this includes the cultural preference for escape scapegoating above seeking actual justice for abuses or accusations of abuse. Now, the specific form of abuse that Bride experienced as a young girl can be described or classified as neglect. When she was just a baby, her father walked out on her mother and her because she was dark-skinned. And from the very instant of her birth, her mother also did not really want her, did not want to see her, did not want to touch her. But being left to raise Bride on her own, the mother, named Sweetness in the novel, refuses to touch Bride, refuses to show her any sign of affection, refuses to acknowledge her even as her daughter, saying that Bride should call her Sweetness and not call her mother. And one of Bride's biggest secrets and one of her biggest regrets is catalyzed by her desire to feel her mother's touch, to simply have her mother hold her hand. Now, Sweetness, Bride's mother, is definitely the most overtly colorist character in the novel. She expresses her disdain and resentment for Bride's dark skin tone, but she also shares some historical context about her family. Many of her family members were very light-skinned and could pass for white sometimes. And so she talks about the advantages and privileges that they got as a family because of their lighter skin tones. There's one specific memory that Sweetness shares about trying to find an apartment and having to leave Bride at home because landlords would see that she's a black child and it would be harder for her to get a place with a black child than it would on her own as a very light-skinned woman. Now, according to Sweetness, she does all of this in order to help Bride, and she says it's in her daughter's best interest to learn how to deal with the harshness of the world and learn how to navigate the world as a dark-skinned black girl with the belief that the world is going to treat you in much the same way, so you might as well get used to it, basically is her mother's argument. And even in the present, Sweetness doesn't really think she did anything wrong. In fact, she even uses language like, it's not my fault, I didn't do it, I'm not to blame, and I don't know who is. And I would say in a larger cosmic sense, she's right. Sweetness as an individual did not create racism, did not create the white lies, white violence, white oppression. She is a victim of it, even as she is also internalizing it and perpetuating it forward. So I always say none of us are to blame for our oppression, but we are responsible for our own healing from it. So Bride physically regresses back into a younger girl, starting with losing her ear piercings, losing her physical shape, and all the things that we expect girls to develop as a result of puberty. Bride starts to regress physically, and the readers are expected to suspend disbelief. There's no explanation as to how it's happening or if it's really happening in the real world or just in Bride's mind, but that's not what's important in the novel anyway. The more important thing is why it's happening. This regression is asking Bride to care for and to simply acknowledge really the young girl version of herself that's still very much present in the present moment, and to offer her the love, acknowledgement, recognition, and healing that she deserves and that she couldn't get from the adults around her at that time, but that Bride, as the adult now, can retroactively provide for her own inner child. Morrison's novel is not just about us healing our own inner child as individuals, but it's also about us as adults stepping up and showing up to protect all children from these types of abuses, traumas, and forms of neglect. And my philosophy is that a major part of looking out for the best interests of future generations is to make sure we are healing ourselves so that we don't perpetuate abuses forward the way Sweetness has. And the novel ends with this exact potential. Though we can't know for sure, we can be certain that there is at least the potential for this kind of healing to happen. Do I recommend this read? Absolutely. The story itself is actually pretty engaging. But if you want more recommendations for books about colorism, have a look at this playlist over here. See you in the next video. Much love.